For today's webinar, we have Dr. Heidi Eldridge, a research forensic scientist with RTI International, Dr. Barbara Spellman, a professor at the University of Virginia, and Dr. Thomas Busey, a professor at Indiana University, presenting human factors in forensic science practice. Without further delay, here's Dr. Eldridge, Dr. Spellman, and Dr. Busey.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to listen to our talk on the Human Factors in Forensic Science Practice project. You have three hosts here with you today who are three of the authors on this project, and we're going to go ahead and move through introductions, and then we'll talk a little bit about the project itself, and then we'll have some time at the end for discussion and Q&A. So here's the beginning of the introduction. I'm Heidi Eldridge. I work at RTI International, and I was one of the editors on this project. My background is in crime scenes and latent prints, but mostly in latent prints. So I am a forensic scientist who became a forensic science researcher. And I'll pass it off to Bobby to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Bobby Spellman. My background is both as a lawyer and a cognitive psychologist. I work at the University of Virginia and right now at the School of Law. And I'm very interested in the intersection of law and psychology, and you'll see how both of those things apply in the discussion later on.
I'm Tom Busey. I'm a professor at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, and I've worked in forensics for almost 2 decades now. And most of my work is, well, I'm all over the place. I study human expertise, I study decision-making, and a little bit of laboratory culture that I'll talk about later on today.
Awesome. Thanks, you guys. So I'm going to start off the introduction with just talking a little bit about what the project is and why we did the project and what we hope to accomplish with it. So essentially, this Human Factors in Forensic Science Practice Sourcebook was intended to raise awareness about human factors in forensic science for the forensic science community. A lot of times, laboratories haven't really thought about how human factors might affect forensic science, or if they did, they often have a very narrow view of human factors. They might be familiar with E.T.L. Dror's work, they might have heard about bias, but they aren't really necessarily aware that there are other parts of human factors that can affect forensic science, both positively and negatively. And so we really wanted to try to highlight some of those areas and to give forensic science practitioners and managers a sense of how human factors can affect forensic science and how they can use that knowledge to implement policies or practices that might produce better outcomes through forensic science work, make the environment more comfortable for forensic science practitioners, and just generally improve the way we do forensic science. So the 3 bullet points that we have up here on the screen right now are essentially that we wanted to look at what sort of human factors knowledge already exists out in the psychology literature, and how well can we apply that knowledge to forensic science practice, or is there specifically research existing already that does apply those human factors to forensic science knowledge. We also wanted, as I mentioned, to say how human factors can be leveraged to improve forensic science. And finally, we wanted to identify sort of the research gaps that exist to let researchers know, these are things that we need you to look into, to let funders know we'd like you to fund the researchers to do these kinds of research so that we can strengthen forensic science using some human factors approaches. So in order to do this, we assembled a working group. This is a project that started at RTI way back in 2015, and it was part of the Forensic Technology Center of Excellence, which is funded by NIJ. And this was something that NIJ and our director of the Center of Forensic Science at the time, John Morgan, came up with together as a project. And so we really wanted to bring in both forensic scientists and psychologists to work on this program. And I will show you in a minute what the workflow was, sort of how we went through this process. But essentially, we recruited 5 psychologists who had expertise in different areas. And then we recruited forensic scientists who sort of self-selected. We put out a call for interested parties to apply to be part of this working group. And we tried to select forensic scientists from a number of different disciplines so that we would have a broad perspective of operational needs in different forensic science disciplines. And so we selected those people. And then we also had some support from staff at RTI, staff at NIJ, and we had Melissa Taylor from NIST. And so all of these people got together to work on this project. The people with asterisks after their names, unfortunately, were not able to be with the project the whole way through due to other obligations. So we did have a slightly reduced group by the end. As you'll hear, this project had some longevity. It went on for a while. So what we did to develop the source book is we had 3 in-person working group meetings where we brought everybody together to talk about human factors issues. And we started off in the very first meeting where each of our psychologists did a brief presentation on their particular area of psychological expertise and what research was sort of out there in that area. And then we had several of the forensic scientists give presentations on their discipline of forensic science and the particular operational challenges that they might face doing forensic science from a sort of human factors perspective. So there was really just a learning session at the beginning for the forensic scientists to learn about psychological research that existed and for the psychologists to learn about what sort of challenges we were facing in forensic science. And after we had those presentations, we spent the rest of that meeting and sort of the next meeting just talking and brainstorming and learning from each other, sort of seeing how we thought some of these human factors principles could be applied to forensic science if they hadn't been already. From that, we sort of came up with topic areas that aligned both with the expertise of the psychologists we had on board and with the gaps that we were identifying as things that were of interest to the community. So we assigned one article or chapter to each of those topics, with the psychologist leading the writing and the thinking for those articles. And we paired each of them with usually 2 or 3 forensic scientists who could sort of balance out with the perspective of, what their needs were in the forensic science community. And then we, in the sort of second meeting and the third meeting, we spent some time on writing sessions where the groups tried to actually put these thoughts onto paper and come up with some sort of meaningful overview of the topic. And what we found was that a lot of these areas, there's a lot of general psychological research, but not as much applied research that's specific to forensic science. So we were doing a lot of, well, we know this principle is important. We hope it applies. We think it would look like this if we tried to apply it. But we ended up with a lot of sort of calls for more research that was specific to forensic science. And we did have some publication challenges. As I noted, we began this project in 2015. We originally had hoped to publish, I think our first target date was like the end of 2017. And just things happened. We had scheduling conflicts, we had publishing conflicts, we had changes in how we wanted to publish this. At one point, it was going to be a book. At one point, it was going to be articles. At one point, NIJ was publishing. At one point, RTI was publishing. And so each time one of those decisions changed, that sort of set the schedule back a little bit. And we did want this to go through a peer review process, so that takes a while as well. So at the end of the day, we ended up publishing through the journal FSI Synergy as a special issue, meaning that the only contents of the issue were the 5 articles of this source book. And it did go through the peer review process. So that is now freely available, and we can drop a link at the end of the webinar to give everybody direct access to those articles. So what we're going to spend some time doing now is just sort of going through a high-level overview of the content of those articles. We're trying to avoid the book report format too much, but we do want to give everyone an idea of what's in these articles to whet your appetite. So hopefully you'll go and read the entire project. So I'm going to start with the first article that appears in the project. We did these in a sort of chronological order. It was sort of a chronological order because we sort of said, well, the first thing that is of concern is personnel selection. First, you have to hire the people that are going to be working in your laboratory. So this is the title of the first article, The Need for Research-Based Tools for the Personnel Selection and Assessment in Forensic Sciences. And those are the authors. And essentially, the important ideas out of this article are that in forensic science, we have some challenges around personnel selection and assessment. Historically, we're not necessarily really great at recruiting the correct candidates and retaining those candidates. We tend to have a lot of applicants because of the CSI effect, right? Everybody wants to be a CSI. But it turns out that although we might get 400 or 1,000 applicants, we have a hard time finding a good one out of that pool. People who are applying are not necessarily having the skill set that we're looking for in these positions. And there are some challenges around that are built right into our institutional constraints because our HR departments are going to dictate what kinds of questions we're allowed to ask, what kind of tools and instruments we're allowed to create. And we don't typically in police laboratories have IO psychologists on staff. IO stands for industrial organizational. And those are the people who really specialize in deconstructing a job and finding out what types of skills you need to do that job. So that's called a job analysis. And it's how they determine the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are specific to that role. And as those of us who are forensic scientists know, not only do forensic scientists need particular knowledge, skills, and abilities, but each kind of forensic scientist needs particular knowledge, skills, and abilities, right? The latent print examiner doesn't necessarily need the same skill set as the DNA analyst, as the, fire reconstructionist. So without having those IO psychologists on staff, it becomes really challenging for forensic organizations or police organizations to correctly identify the parts that they need out of each person to build a good candidate. So the way that we like to do this is we're looking for something called predictors of performance. And predictors of performance are measurable attributes that you can use to try to get at those underlying knowledge, skills, and abilities. So for instance, if you were to say, well, we need people with great visual acuity to be latent print examiners, then you would want to have some sort of a test that you could give to your applicants to see whether they had the correct visual acuity to be able to do the job. Currently, the main things we use as predictors of performance are whether they meet the minimum qualifications, like do they have the correct degree, and what comes out in the interviews, which is a little bit limiting. So some of the areas that we like to look into are cognitive ability, which are tests that can be given to see whether people have good memory, whether they have good visual acuity, whether they can figure out spatial relationships, whether they can think logically. And those kinds of tests are really easy to administer, but they do have a downside in that they can separate different groups of people unfairly. There can be sort of racial biases that come out in these tests and that sort of thing. So you have to use those with caution. It might be better to just draw a sort of pass-fail line with these tests rather than saying you only take the people who are at the top, because that could be building biases into your selection process. Another thing we can look at is personality, which is made up of all of these things listed under personality on the screen here. We're very interested in resilience these days. How do people deal with tough times within forensic science? Emotional intelligence, which helps to identify the people who will be good team members, who will be able to interact with others in positive ways. The Big Five is a psychological test that measures these 5 things in the parenthetical here: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And they found good correlation between particularly conscientiousness and job success across a number of different domains. And then finally, we can use work sample tests, which are great because they let us see if a person has the actual skills that they will need on the job. And they can also give the candidate a sampling of what the job is like, which may allow the candidate to self-select if it's really not the kind of work they want to do. The trouble with the work sample tests is that they're much harder to design and administer. They're much more time consuming and sometimes difficult to interpret. So that's sort of the take-home messages of that article. And again, we can talk about them more during the Q&A if people want to know more. The second article is about the benefit of errors during training. And this is an interesting topic because in our culture, we tend to shy away from errors. And particularly in the forensic science culture, we tend to shy away from errors and feel like if you have to admit on the stand that you ever made an error, that's going to go badly for you. So you have to be perfect from the word go. And it turns out that's not actually a really healthy way to learn. We actually can learn a lot from our errors as long as we get good feedback. And by making those errors and receiving feedback on those errors, we can actually learn the material better than we would have if we had not made the error in the first place. So this article is really about how you can leverage those errors to learn better. The important points are that you do need that timely feedback. Getting feedback months down the road is not going to be as helpful as getting it right away. And part of that feedback involves reviewing why you made the error, deconstructing the error so that you can learn from it rather than just saying, oh, you got it wrong and moving on. Another thing that's interesting from the psychological literature we learned is that you tend to learn more from the error when the error was made on a high confidence answer. In other words, if you were really sure you were right, and then somebody comes along and tells you were wrong, it kind of makes a big impression on you. And so you're more likely to recall that you made that error and internalize the correct response than if it was something that you weren't that confident in the first place. We also learn in this chapter that the training should continue throughout the career. Just because you finished training and been signed off for independent casework doesn't mean you should be done learning. And we want to highlight that forensic science errors do have systemic consequences. This is why people get really concerned about making them. They can lead to lawsuits, they can lead to problems for the department, but they can also lead to difficulty for the individual examiner when they're on the stand being asked those questions. So it's really important that we have some trust there where when you're on the stand, you're able to say, you know what, yes, I have made errors within my training. And that not sort of be held against you because your training is the place where you're supposed to fail and grow and become better at what you do. The idea is to avoid making errors in the actual casework. That's the part we're concerned about. So the recommendations from this article are that we want training exercises to progress in difficulty as you go so that you do induce errors so that you can fall down in training, deconstruct your error, learn from it, and be better on the other side. And then we also want trainers to be giving personal and engaged feedback, not just leaving a test on your desk that says this one's wrong, this one's wrong, this one's wrong, but actually sitting down and helping you work through why those errors were made. We also want to see a continuation of challenging exercises throughout people's careers so that they can continue to grow and their skills don't become stagnant. And we do need, in this area in particular, we need to see some forensic science specific research because a lot of the psychological research that exists right now is in different enough domains that we're not sure how directly applicable it is.
Okay, thank you, Heidi. What we do in this next article is to first describe general properties of normal human reasoning. We then explain how reasoning in forensic science might differ in important ways and discuss some of the consequences of those differences. So, big picture. Human reasoning, it's an amazing thing. And we can think about the information we use in reasoning as coming from two very different types of sources. One is top-down reasoning. What we as humans, we know, we experience, we have goals and desires, all these things that are in our head, think of as top-down reasoning. The other is bottom-up reasoning. What's actually out there in the environment? What are we using to generate some of our thoughts? The thing is that what we end up with, where you are here, is that what you perceive, what you understand, what you remember, the judgments you make, all of those things are a product of both top-down reasoning, what's in your head, and bottom-up reasoning, what's in the environment. So here's one of my favorite examples. You've probably seen visual illusions, something like this. This is, to me, an extreme one because I've seen this a million times, and I know that the guy in the back toward the right is the same size as the other three guys, but he always looks bigger to me. Now, why is that? Well, for those of us who have been brought up looking in down subway trains or in other environments where there's perspective that goes out into the distance like this, we're used to seeing things get smaller in the distance. And so because this guy doesn't seem to be getting any smaller in the distance, according to those lines, he looks to us as if he's getting bigger. Now, if you don't have experience like that, if you're brought up in some situation or some culture without a lot of right angles and a lot of buildings, they may actually end up looking the same. And if you don't believe me that two people looking at the same thing can see very different things, go argue about this with your friends. So here are some characteristics of human reasoning that normally mostly work. So as I just said, we naturally combine information from multiple sources. We're also not conscious of some of the sources. So, for example, we don't realize that we're using the perspective information in making our size judgments, but sometimes we're also not aware of the sources. We are not aware of some of the things that impinge on our decision making. Another thing is that the source of information matters to our value. So we may believe a reliable friend more likely than an unreliable friend. We might like DNA evidence, think it's more reliable than other kinds of evidence. And then what we do is we take the information and we fit it together into sensible stories. This is how normal reasoning works. But things that we often do that don't work are things like motivated reasoning, confirmation bias, and bias blind spot. You may have heard of motivated reasoning, and you probably have only heard of one side of it. So motivated reasoning is usually talked of as the bad guy. It's the thing that makes us want to reason so that we come up with our desired conclusion. But it turns out that motivated reasoning also has another component, and that is that as human beings, we have self-esteem and we would like to be correct. So we also are motivated to be correct. And it's only when the information is sort of ambiguous that we may prefer desired over correct. If something is clearly correct, despite our desired answer, we're very likely to go with the correct one. Confirmation bias, also you probably have heard of, is can be thought of as a subset of motivated reasoning. And it's thinking about how if you have some information that supports some hypothesis, and maybe it's the hypothesis you like, you go out and you find other information that supports the hypothesis. And when you find that other information, you think it has great value, it makes you more certain of your hypothesis. And it also stops you from going out to look at information regarding other hypotheses. And if you find information that supports other hypotheses, you may disregard it, you may devalue it. So this is what's often called tunnel vision. The bias blind spot refers to the idea that we all are very good at seeing biases in other people's reasoning. We're very bad at seeing biases in our own reasoning. So we ourselves may be victims of motivated reasoning or confirmation bias, and we're not likely to see it, that that's what we ourselves are doing. So these things that often don't work are not good for regular reasoning, and they're also not good for forensic science reasoning. A short summary of what these things do is they make you cut off alternative hypothesis prematurely. And as you can imagine, this is a bad thing in forensic science. We would like to keep our hypotheses open and come up with multiple hypotheses as much as we need to when trying to figure things out and then coming to the right answer, not prematurely. But here's the rub. The things that mostly work for normal reasoning, well, they're not necessarily so good for forensic reasoning. And here's why. Let me give you an example. Suppose some fingerprints come into the lab, and I hate to use the expression match because I think it's misleading, but I'm going to use it anyway because it's a lot simpler than other explanations. So suppose you're a fiction rich examiner and you're trying to figure out whether this latent print is a match to a print of somebody that is considered to be a suspect. And so it's a little blurry and you're not quite sure. But then, either accidentally or intentionally, you learn that that particular suspect has made a confession to having done this crime. And now you look at the fingerprints and it looks a little clearer and it looks a little more likely that the two of them match. And you think, wow, maybe you don't think, but this is what's happening. The confession evidence is making you believe more likely that the fingerprint is a match. And alternatively, hearing that the fingerprint is a match might make the confession seem more likely to be true. Okay, now some DNA evidence comes along and you learn about this, And now you're quite sure that your fingerprints are a match, and you're quite sure that the confession evidence is reliable, and you're quite sure that the DNA evidence is reliable. So they're all supporting each other. All right, you might all be right, and this might all be justified, but one thing, you shouldn't be doing this because it's not the forensic scientist's job. The forensic scientist, at least the lab scientists, want to be able to say with accuracy, reliability, how sure that they are that the fingerprint is a match, how sure they are that the DNA is a match, how sure they are that the confession is true or accurate. And these things need to be assessed reliably and independently, because it's the jury's job to put them all together, to see if they support each other, to hear all the criticisms of it, to hear the inconsistencies among how these things were retrieved, analyzed. And it is not the job of the forensic scientist. If the forensic scientist does it, then the jury is coming with contaminated information that's artificially inflated, where it's their job and the lawyer's job to sort it out. So for the things that don't often work, we said the main thing here is do not prematurely cut off hypotheses. But for the things that mostly work in normal human reasoning, the main theme is do not rely on information that is irrelevant to your task. If you're doing a friction ridge analysis, it doesn't matter what the DNA said or what a confession said. You should be working on the friction ridge information without being influenced by external sources. So here are some of the problems and solutions that we talk about in this article. Problems, as I just mentioned, two major themes about how to go wrong in doing forensic analysis. Don't rely on information that's relevant to the task, and do not prematurely cut off hypotheses. And the top one may be more relevant to working in the lab, whereas the bottom one may be more relevant to working at crime scenes, but I think they're both really relevant to both situations. We talk about the sources of potential biases, ordinary human reasoning, characteristics of the individual person, and characteristics of the situation. Characteristics of the individual person are things that Heidi talked a bunch about in the two chapters she reviewed before my talk, and characteristics of the situation involve some things that Tom will talk about in the two talks after my talk. And if you want to know about fixers, let's move on to the next talk. Take it away, Tom.
Thanks. In the first of the two final chapters, I'd like to talk about stressors in forensic organizations, some of the risks that are involved, and some of the solutions that we've proposed. And this is with my colleagues Laura Sedkamp, Melissa Taylor, and Alice White. So we've focused in this chapter, and I'm just going to give you some of the bullet points here. We focused on the characteristics of high reliability organizations. What makes an organization robust against problems? And it seems like every month or every week there is another story of another lab in crisis. And part of that is politics, but part of that is internal structures. So one of the characteristics of high reliability organizations is a preoccupation with failure. What are the failure points? Constantly thinking about what can go wrong here, how can we improve things, constant striving towards improvement and not just resting on SOPs that were written a decade ago. Along with that, there's a reluctance to simplify interpretations. So the situations that we deal with are complex. And, sometimes some disciplines are pretty straightforward. You have an impression from a crime scene, you're comparing against a known standard. Other times you have a very complex situation where you have crime scene investigations that are very difficult to sort of conceptualize as a single unit. So thinking about all the different elements that interact, we discuss in the paper. Along with that is this idea of sensitivity to operations. So what is the political environment that you operate in? Are you part of the prosecutor's office or are you independent? Where does your money come from? Who are you going to piss off if you make mistakes? And being sensitive to those kinds of political environments is important. And I'll talk about the importance of being independent. And this is a nationwide movement, I think, that's a positive one. Commitment to resilience is another element to this. And I think this is something that is part of something we've seen, just to use a recent analogy in the news, one of the struggles that Russia's having in Ukraine right now is when their generals get killed, the individual soldiers don't really know what to do. And the US military is very proud of the fact that their decision makers propagate down to the individual units. And so they have a lot more flexibility. So the metaphor is probably incomplete when applied to forensic disciplines. I just want to point out that there are examples of flexibility and resilience at different levels, and that might be something that could be applied to forensics as well. And finally, avoiding deference to expertise. So oftentimes training in forensics adopts a mentor model, and that works okay for training. Then some of the comments earlier on really hit the mark with respect to the mentor-mentee relationship. But there are lots of examples in aviation where first officers deferred to pilots and the cockpit flight recorder, and the airplane crash as a result because the airplane ran out of fuel while the pilot was trying to troubleshoot something, and the first officer didn't speak up. So these are examples, I think, of where things can go catastrophically bad when you have deference to expertise. So we just listed a number of different stressors and because we're talking about all of the forensic disciplines, there's a wide range. So vicarious trauma can show up certainly in CSI when you're working murder investigations. Even some of the pattern comparison disciplines will receive evidence from crime scenes that might be very difficult to deal with, and this should be acknowledged by the laboratory, and a plan should be put in place to deal with this kind of vicarious trauma. Another example, I think, of failures in the discipline is examiners who think that they defend the discipline or that they work for the prosecutor, that somehow if they're not IDing the guy or solving crime, that they are not doing their job. And I think we should view our jobs as serving the justice system, not serving the prosecutor. There's a fair amount of sort of psychological issues with respect to backlogs that are never ending, the monotony of the job, at least a lack of motivation, and maybe a lack of career mobility. Lots of jobs have lots of different hierarchies, and a lab may just have people who do the casework, and then a lab manager, and then maybe an overall director. But thinking about how to move up the ladder, whatever that ladder is, I think is important for labs to consider. I think there's a lot of focus on transparency, but by the same token, there's a fear of being watched. And I think less than shielding the examiners from being watched, I think that this should come with the job, that you are a public servant and you are under the microscope, and that's just part of the job. Fatigue is something that will show up a lot, especially if people are working 4 days a week, 10-hour shifts, or CSI who are on site for 24, 36 hours without sleep. That's a real problem that should be addressed by laboratories. And finally, we've talked a lot about errors earlier on in this presentation, but if you think about the pattern comparison disciplines, or any time a decision is made, what constitutes sufficiency for an identification, for example, is really ill-defined. We've, in the United States, not had a point standard in fingerprints, and so it's hard to communicate what is an acceptable response. And I think that's made examiners very conservative and given them a fear of making errors. So let's talk about risk management versus reducing errors. I think, first of all, we simply have to acknowledge that in any system, there are going to be errors, and we should stop trying to minimize errors, that they're just going to happen, and we have to expect that, and it's okay when that happens. Obviously, we want to reduce them wherever possible. I think we also want to avoid a punitive model for errors. So rather than immediately doing corrective action, there are a series of stages I'll talk about in a moment that we could do instead of just saying, you made a mistake, we're pulling you off casework for 2 months while we retrain you. And that's literally an example I've heard from colleagues. So acknowledging the risk that exists, that errors are just going to occur. And finally, we should think about whether examiners need to make decisions or just make observations. So DNA, for example, hardly ever makes decisions. In fact, when they do, it's called transposing the conditional. It's really frowned upon within the DNA community. What they're doing is describing how much support does this have for the two different propositions. And when pattern comparison disciplines say, I identified this, they're not talking about both propositions. They're not talking about the possibility that somebody else could have left this fingerprint. They're just saying this guy did it. So think about whether pattern comparison disciplines really need to make decisions. So here's one response from the just culture approach from David Marks and colleagues. It's a three-step process depending on the severity or the number of errors that have been made, or let's call them outcomes that are maybe not desirable. So there's a console step, there's a coach step, and finally there's a punish step, because I think ultimately there are people who are not appropriate for this job, and you have to ultimately have a step for that. So you can read in the chapter that particular element of it. So the transparency, I think, is good, and thinking about working for the justice system, not the prosecutor or the detective. And I encourage you to read the chapter to learn more about the high reliability organizations and the just culture, especially if you are either a supervisor or have aspirations to be a supervisor. In the second talk, I'd like to talk about the communication that occurs during a forensic investigation. And this is used as a particular metaphor called the pebbles on the scale metaphor. And this project was primarily directed by my colleague Laura Carlson, who's at University of Notre Dame. And she is on her way to becoming a provost at Delaware, and so was unavailable to give this presentation, so I'll give it for her. We also had participation from Jara Kennedy and Kimberly Zeller. So how does communication flow during an investigation? And it turns out that there's a fundamental tension. Examiners want to make independent observations. They don't want to be biased by this other information, especially if it's irrelevant. But examiners need some information to make informed observations. They need to set propositions, or they need to know the relevant search. What kind of crime is it? How big of a database should I search? And so there are inherent dependencies between these two parties as the case evolves. And this requires some complexity to think about how communication flows. And so the purpose of this chapter is to really investigate how the communication flows during an investigation. So you have a detective whose job is to collect evidence and to ask for analyses. And then you have some kind of analyst who's doing the analysis and either reports some observations or makes some conclusion. And the detective then repeats that process, or might eventually move the case forward to prosecution once they've identified a suspect. So the information flow affects how relevant and irrelevant information propagates. DNA analysts need to set propositions and know if relatives are a possibility. For example, a crime scene investigator must develop enough of hypothesis to know what evidence to collect. And they may end up collecting all the evidence or not enough evidence. And both of those are potential problems. So we developed a metaphor for communication. And in this metaphor, and I think this mirrors a common metaphor that's held within the justice system, that is, the justice system acts as a sort of a scale. You have the scales of justice. So I'll talk about how this works, and then I would talk about some of the criticisms of this model as well, because all models are incomplete. So evidence is viewed as pebbles that vary in size, which represent the confidence or the evidentiary strength, and the color, which is the decision or the support. And how the pebble is placed determines the support for the evolving theory. And table 2 in the paper has examples from different disciplines that explain the color, the shape, and how each of these might be placed to support the evolving theory or not. So I mentioned all metaphors are incomplete, but many are useful. This is a play on words from the standard version, which is all models are wrong, but some are useful. This is a standard view in science that to make progress, we need to find explanations or metaphors to help us understand things, but they can also be incomplete. And how they are incomplete actually is also informative. So one of the ways this scale model breaks is with likelihood ratios. So likelihood ratios are used in many disciplines to express the support for one proposition over another proposition. Now, the problem is that likelihood ratios don't add. They multiply the prior odds to produce the posterior odds. And the DNA community is very familiar with these and the difficulty of explaining likelihood ratios. But it's best to think, I believe anyway, that likelihood ratios express who can be excluded based on the evidence. That's more equivalent to the multiplicative operation here. And so that can then be, once you have who can be excluded, that can be sort of translated to the scale-like model. So finally, I want to talk about challenges for this metaphor in terms of who makes the decisions. Detectives want, or at least forensics examiners think they want, clear decisions. Do they have the right person? Should they proceed with a case? As others have pointed out in this presentation as well, without all the facts of the case, a forensic examiner cannot answer this question. They don't have all the information. They don't want all the information. They want to make their decision based on just the information that they need. I'd like to argue that detectives live in a world of gray. If you want to give them partial information, they'll live with that. They work on hunches all of the time. So I think one of the issues with this particular model is when should conclusions be limited to observations as opposed to decisions? And I feel like that's something that each laboratory should deal with as a matter of course in thinking about how they testify and the conclusions that they give. So how do you distinguish between relevant and irrelevant information? Certainly documenting what information you learned and when. Case managers can help shield analysts from irrelevant context. There's a growing literature on linear unmasking as applied to different forensic disciplines, and lab policies should be continuously updated to reflect current best practices. And I just want to leave you with two citations that were published recently by the first one here is really an all-star team of researchers in forensics working in the field of linear sequential unmasking. And so if for more information about this topic and thinking about how it might apply to your laboratory, I'd like to refer you to these articles in Forensic Science International Synergy. Thanks, and we'll move on to discussion and Q&A.
Alrighty, thank you, Dr. Eldridge, Dr. Spellman, and Dr. Busey for those very informative talks. Our presenters will now host a discussion and answer any audience questions.
Great. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'll go ahead and put my camera on. So yeah, we went through several articles there, and sorry, my chat windows are rearranging themselves. Okay, we went through several articles there and gave you guys this sort of overview of what the project is about. We did receive a few questions from the audience, which we can get to in a minute. And we had a few topics that we were prepared to discuss as well, just to sort of get the ball rolling. I wanted to start off by just reminding everybody, sort of for context, we did mention early in the presentation that this project took a while to do. This project went on for 6 years, 5 years, somewhere in there. And the state of the science changed quite a bit over that period of time. So we got in a situation where when we started talking about these things, this was a brand new topic that really nobody was talking about. And by the time we got to the end of the project, there had been some things published on it and more people were talking about it. We hear a lot of people discussing things like resiliency and vicarious trauma now that nobody was discussing 6 years ago. And some of the other references available in the disciplines and all of that have changed. So I just want to put that out there for context, that some of what we had in these early discussions, we may know more about it now than we did at the time when we started this project. So yeah, I think I'll start off with just answering a couple of the questions since we already have some, and then maybe we'll jump back into our other topics to keep the ball rolling there. So let's see, the first question I have here is, would having an anthropologist or forensic anthropologist in the team benefit such studies examining human factors in forensic science? And my answer to that would be that it really depends on what question you're trying to ask, right? Because human factors definitely affects all different forensic science disciplines, but different human factors are going to affect different disciplines in different ways. So if the question was getting at sort of why didn't you have a forensic anthropologist on your team, the answer to that would be partly because none of them applied. Again, this was a self-selecting thing. We put out a call and said, if you're interested, apply. And I don't think we had any forensic anthropologists apply. Part of it is that forensic anthropology is a little bit niche. it's not one of the huger disciplines. There are a lot of students in forensic anthropology, but there are fewer practicing forensic anthropologists. So there's, I think, questions that may apply to more disciplines broadly than just focusing on forensic anthropology. But absolutely, human factors in forensic anthropology are a thing that need to be considered, just like for any other discipline. Let's see.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
Yep. You can hear me from Alaska. That's cool.
We can hear you. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, I'll send some pictures later. It's really important to have people with other perspectives looking at what you do, right? So as I said, we can't see our own biases. And so, hey, we may be the human factors people, but remember, even though we see across disciplines within forensic science, every group says, no, we're better, and every group has biases. Hey guys, we need to look at ourselves too as human factors, most of us psychologists, and get some anthropologists in there and say, hey, from these other perspectives as how humans behave, we need to be looking at some things from this perspective too.
Yeah, thanks, Bobby. And actually, Bobby, while you're here, I think I might punt one of these questions to you. It's flagged as a Heidi question, but I think it might be a Bobby question. It says, if a forensic science expert reads case documents prepared by law enforcement agencies, can this negatively affect their decision-making process when analyzing evidence?
Yeah, I think that's been part of the external influence biasing that people have been talking about, but I'm not really clear here what would be in the report. So I can't totally answer that question.
Yeah, I think that's one of those things that varies a lot as well, from agency to agency and even from case to case. I mean, I've read reports that were super brief and just sort of said the bare outline of what happened. And I've had some where there was lots of hypothesizing happening in the report and lots of information that probably would be biasing. So that's
hey, did everybody see that in the New York Times today? There was an article about forensic science gone bad by medical examiners. I saw it in Alaska, so it must be in the States by now.
I'm sure it is. I haven't seen the paper today yet. I'll have to look out for that one. Okay, so that one's answered. Let's see. So there's another question here that says, Heidi, do you feel that forensic scientists are held to a standard that is incompatible with other scientists? For example, in casework, we are often asked to form our opinion on a source decision without any consultation with other forensic scientists because that may be viewed as undue influence or introducing bias. I think this touches on both Tom and Bobby's talks. The communication piece of how much information do we get from other sources versus how much do we keep ourselves in our little tunnel to avoid bias. But also the piece about what is our job versus what is the jury's job. It's important that we be transparent and that we be shielded to the extent that's appropriate. How much that extent is going to differ depending on the situation. Like if you're a crime scene person, you need a fair amount of contextual information to make good choices about what to collect. But if you're a latent print person, sort of the example that Bobby was giving, you don't need to know the DNA results to do your latent print analysis. So you have to look at the context of what are your priorities based on what information do you need for the task you're doing. But when it comes time for making your conclusion, we have to stay in our own lane as forensic scientists. We have to stick to giving the strength of our evidence and not trying to give the jury the conclusion and tell them what their decision ought to be. And I think that's the tricky part. Tom or Bobby, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, yeah, would the question here be more about having, say, 3 independent fingerprint examiners look at the same information and then discuss what they come to as a conclusion? Because if that's the analogy, actually, I think that's quite good.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure. The question says, asked to form our opinion on a source decision without any consultation with other forensic scientists. So that may be talking about having several people look at the same information. But I think it's talking about them not talking to each other, but just reaching independent conclusions.
Yeah, it's quite clear that independence is the way to go. I mean, if you have people getting together and talking, ultimately you could reduce that down to just one person. If everyone just sort of defers to one person, for example, that would be an example of dependencies that would not be good. So you need sort of independent judgments and then some kind of information aggregator and then some mechanism for deciding what the consensus view is or how to move forward based on that. I think everyone has their own bias on biases. I think of biases as they are effectively not something you have, they are something that you are. That everything is, I think, not bias so much as bad or good. It's like a preference or something. And so because it's not something you can sort of overcome, it's more of something that you need to acknowledge that it exists, and that certainly documenting when you get information and how that information might have influenced you, or there's certainly a case where you could overcompensate for bias. So really, that's the challenge with bias, is that it's not something you can avoid or somehow get rid of. It's going to be intrinsically part of every decision you make. There's some amount of information that's sufficient for identification, and how much that sufficiency level could be considered as bias. So I guess that's my view on bias. It is you. It is not something you have.
Good point. Tom, there's another question here for you if we want to take that one next. It says, actually, there's a couple for you. One says, what is the difference between an observation and a decision?
So really good question. And the answer is that when you make a decision, you're effectively taking on the role of the finder of fact. So that's the judge or the jury or potentially the prosecutor if they're deciding whether to offer a plea deal. And that's really not the job of a forensic examiner. They should be describing the support for one of two propositions: either the suspect left this mark at the crime scene, or some unknown person left this mark at the crime scene, or a sample or whatever. That you're describing the support for those two hypotheses. You're not saying this guy left it. That's the job of the fact finder. They have all of the information. That's their job. You should basically be making observations about what's the likelihood of observing this amount of correspondence given the suspect left the mark or left the fingerprint. What's the probability of observing this amount of correspondence given someone else left the fingerprint at the crime scene? Those are examples of observations. And the decision is what we think of in statistics as a posterior. You are drawing a conclusion. That's not your job. That is the job of the finder of fact.
Thank you. Let's see, here's a question to all of us. Somebody said, can you please address some of the areas in this field for future PhD researchers? Might need some clarification on that one, actually. I don't know if the person who asked it can give us a little bit more information, or are you asking us to do the research? Or are you asking us which areas need the research the most?
I think some of the cutting edge domains are certainly in individual disciplines trying to figure out quantitative measures of the strength of that evidence in that discipline. And there's lots of research in that field. I also think about how, in the personnel matters, how should management deal with employees who are not performing the way we think they might, and what model should they use? And so really management should think about things in terms of nurturing your employees and figuring out how to motivate them, which I think is a constant struggle. So those are, I think, the two, in my mind, the most relevant domains.
Yeah, I think from the two articles that I covered, there's definitely need for forensic specific research. You know, in the personnel, we've got all of this stuff about instruments that should be developed and KSAs that should be measured, but we don't really have any instruments that have been developed specifically for forensic professionals that have been tested to see whether they're effective in recruiting the right forensic professionals. You know, we have like the form blindness test for latent prints, but we don't really know how well it actually works. And so when we're making those personnel decisions, it would be great to have some research to point to and say, you know, we know that when people score well on these particular instruments, 10 years later, they're successful in this field. You know, that kind of thing would be really helpful. Same with the errors. The literature on learning from errors is fascinating, and I would encourage everybody to read the summary article there. But a lot of it is focused on tasks that are fundamentally kind of different than the tasks we do in forensic science. They're things like, you know, memorizing a pair of words, which is, again, fascinating, but may not translate well to, you know, having memory of an image when you're going to do a comparison or something like that. So it would be really useful to have some of those basic scientific, psychological projects redone in the forensic domain to see if those principles translate. And then we can use those to strengthen our training programs. Bobby?
Yeah, in terms of personnel, I think it's really interesting question to see whether there should be a difference in characteristics between people who are doing examinations in the lab versus examinations in the field, where things are more, you know, open to hypothesis generation. And I think, you know, a lot of people move from one to the other, and I'm not sure that the same skills are useful in both. And then second, I recently got an email from a young woman interested in doing studies on crime scene examination itself, where there's some VR working on this, where investigators go into a virtual reality situation and, you know, perform an investigation. And there's so much data there, trying to understand what they're doing, why they're doing it, what might be better done, generalizable. So if anybody out there is doing that kind of stuff, I have a young woman interested in joining the crowd. And if not, I think there's a marvelous opportunity to do real research on how general characteristics of human reasoning play out in the forensic environment.
Yeah, thank you, Bobby.
Over.
And with that, unfortunately, we do not have time to finish all of the questions today, but do feel free to reach out to us for additional information. There are going to be some final slides coming up in just a moment that include all of our contact information. So we would love to hear from you. And thank you all for attending.
Before you leave today's webinar, please participate in our short 5-minute survey. Simply click the checkbox icon directly above the chat to access the audience feedback survey for today's event. Your feedback is critical information that helps us improve our webinars and continue providing the best experience possible. We would greatly appreciate it. Lastly, across the top of the live stream window are links to our social media profiles, including Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. There is also a link to the FTCOE website, the Just Science podcast, and the FTCOE newsletter registration. Like, follow, or subscribe to stay up to date with everything the FTCOE is doing in support of the forensic community. Thank you again for attending, and we hope everyone has a great day.